In the previous module, you had the opportunity to review the information you need to structure an argument. You learned how to outline an argument and how to describe it to others. In this video, we'll talk about guidelines for communicating arguments. So once you've put the argument together, how you communicate it to other people and share the information that you learned. Imagine that this is you in front of a large stadium audience communicating your quantitative argument. A little optimistic maybe, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. Whether you're speaking or writing or giving a presentation, effective communication isn't just a service that you give to your audience. It's also an exercise for you in structuring your thinking and clarifying the way you look at your problem or argument. So beyond developing a basic competence, you really want to get a sense of who you are as a communicator and how you communicate. You want to be able to look at each individual situation and determine the best way to communicate the information for that time and audience. The first step in any communication is knowing your audience. You want to think about the background that your audience has. What do they know about the problem that you're communicating already? What information will be new to them? If you're communicating something technical, you need to think about what kind of terminology you can use. For example, if you're an engineer and you're communicating information to a lay audience, you want to avoid using technical terminology without defining that terminology thoroughly. Or, better yet, avoiding the terminology entirely and using words that a layperson can understand. You also want to develop the correct voice. That's not just about using intonation when you're speaking to show that something's really exciting or really disappointing. You also want to set the right tone by varying your syntax. That is, things like the sentence length or the punctuation that you use. It's important that you develop the correct voice for your audience. If you're in a formal situation, you want to use a formal voice, something that commands power and respect. But if you're teaching a class, you might want to be more entertaining and funny and amusing to keep people interested. Along the same line, you should always strive to use an invitational tone. Reach out to the audience. This will make the difference between whether they pay attention to what you're talking about or totally zone out. You can do this by using words like you or let's, something that makes the audience feel involved in what's going on. So, for example, you could say, let's now examine, and then begin introducing your topic. You also can use direction words like remember or assume or question to help the audience to know what they should be thinking about at a given time. Remember when we talked about voice. This is an example of how you set the right voice, figuring out how much of an invitational tone to use and where to use it. Clarity is also very important. Unclear usage can really bog down an argument. And one of the key things you want to look at is watching out for pronouns, words like it and that refer to something that was introduced previously. This can be an issue because sometimes you refer to many different phenomena, and then if you use a word like it or that, the reader or audience may not be certain of what you're talking about. So you need to be very careful to clarify your actor in each sentence. You should also use transition words like and, or, but, thus, and therefore that help people to be guided through the argument. Make sure that people know the relationship from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, and section to section. And that applies whether you're speaking, writing, or even using diagrams. Formality is also important. This is a more nuanced take on the issue of tone and voice. Formality could apply to the way you speak. For example, if you're giving a formal presentation using a very commanding tone of voice, or if you're teaching a class using a more entertaining tone of voice. But formality also applies to writing. If you're making a presentation, it's typically okay to use shorthand. But if you're doing a formal report, you typically shouldn't use shorthand. Or if you do, you should at least make sure that you define that shorthand in advance of using it for the first time. But regardless of the context, if you use shorthand, you want to make sure that you're always consistent in the way you use it to avoid any confusion for the audience. This is part of the issue that we talked about earlier of clarity. Once you have a sense of how you should present your information, you want to think about what to present. This is content. And the question that you should always ask yourself with respect to content is what's important. You can think of content like this funnel. A lot of things go into the process of creating the information that's going to be communicated. You've done a lot of work, typically, by the time you solved a problem. However, you don't want to include all of that information. You shouldn't talk people through every thought that you have or every route that you went down. So you want to think about what the key issues are. Remember that your goal is to transmit insight, not just information. So you want to include just enough detail so that the audience knows what's going on. You should include any key theorems that you use and highlight unexpected or interesting parts of the analysis. Make sure that the important aspects of the argument really stand out. This can involve using keywords, perhaps using bullet points or boxes, or creating a tone that really builds power until it leads to a conclusion. The conclusion should feel like the climax of the presentation. Along with this, you want to make sure to avoid what's called a red herring. A red herring is a piece of information that's referred to somewhere in a document and then never referred to again. So it may appear in the document to be key and be stuck in someone's mind, but it's never really clear how that information factors into the actual argument. Make sure that in your editing process, you remove any red herrings. Along the same line, creating a structure for the argument is important. Structure can create a lot of value for the reader. Length and technical details can really bog a reader down, so you want to summarize and outline at the beginning. Remember that most technical communications or quantitative communications are not mystery novels. You don't need to save the conclusion for last. State what it is right up front. Say what analysis you did in very brief terms, and then state the conclusion, and then go into your larger argument to prove that conclusion. Similarly, skimmability is key. Use what I like to call the first and last sentence of the paragraph rule. Just by reading the first and last sentences of each paragraph in a written document, or the same basically goes for a speech, it should be clear approximately what's going on in the document. People should know the overall structure of the argument. Use words like as, given, thus, therefore, since, first, second, last, because, etc. to help people to understand what's going on. So people should be able to look from paragraph to paragraph and basically know what's happening. For example, looking at the structure that's diagrammed here, start with the context and the problem, the question that was asked, assumptions that were made, equations that were used, perhaps a graph of what was going on, analysis of the graph, interpretation of that analysis, putting this interpretation in context, and then the solution or conclusion once again. And once you've done all of your communication, you've written a first draft, simplify. Always think about how you can make the argument more concise and simpler. Ask the question, what's essential, again and again and again. Were all of the tools that you introduced actually used in the course of the argument? So streamline as much as possible. You want to make sure that you illustrate difficult ideas and demonstrate key ideas, but you don't want to confuse people. And the final rule of communication is the simplest of all, edit. You should never just write a first draft and then present it. Always edit to remove as much information as possible that's unnecessary so that you have the most streamlined, effective argument possible. By the end of an argument, it may be clear that you didn't present it in the best way the first time. You should always make an effort to go back. Remember, this isn't just for the audience, it's for you. Understanding the best way to communicate a problem, a solution, or other piece of information can really help you to understand the information you're trying to communicate in a different way. Looking at things from a different perspective is always valuable in any problem-solving process.